Okay, awesome. So New Year's Eve of 2019 was the calm before the storm for the Hall family. That's my last name. It was the calm before the storm. We had just gotten home a day prior to that, the day before New Year's Eve, from a good time with my family. We drove up to Northern California and spent a couple days with my mom, spent a couple days with my dad, and had a really good time. We drove back. We wanted to spend New Year's Eve at home with our family, and so New Year's Eve we stayed up. I don't even know if I stayed up till midnight. In your 40s, you're like, I'm not doing that anymore. But I go to bed on New Year's Eve, and I get a phone call early in the morning on New Year's Day, which was very strange. And it was a call from my father's caretaker. My dad, who's 80 years old, had someone who would come over to his house several times a week just to check in on him and make sure everything was okay and all that kind of stuff. And she felt prompted, legitimately, she said, by the Holy Spirit to show up on New Year's morning, which normally is a holiday, and she wouldn't go there. But she thought, well, I'm not doing anything. I'm going to go check in on Daryl and see how he's doing. So she shows up early morning, and there he is on the floor of his bedroom, face down, on his bedroom floor. And so she immediately calls 911. And he was somewhat responsive, but so she calls 911. They're on their way over, and she immediately calls me. And therefore, it was the first day of 2020, the greatest year of all years for all of us. Began essentially a 9-month storm in the life of me and my family. And I've shared a little bit of this before. For those of you who've been with us for a while, you know. So the next day, I drove up to Northern California to try to find out what the story was going on with my father. And it turned out that he had total kidney failure and was probably not going to make it. And so so many of you began praying for us and all that kind of stuff. We really appreciate it. But I spent the next 14 days in the hospital with my father until ultimately he passed away on January 14th. Well, that was only obviously a huge thing. If any of you lost your father, you know that's just a big void that gets left especially in a man's heart. There was a lot of issues surrounding that. My father had a lot of unfinished things in his life. And to say a lot of unfinished things is probably a gross understatement for those of you that know. I'm an only child by birth, and so it was my sole responsibility to take care of basically finish all of his life for him. I took a 6-month leave of absence from the church here in order to take care of that, and the staff elders did an amazing job of kind of walking us through that season for us. But spent that hospital. He passes away. We were planning the funeral. There was a massive amounts of work to do. My father was a hoarder. His house was completely undone. We filled 6 of the largest dumpsters you can possibly, the biggest ones. We filled those with stuff to get his house uncluttered and able to move forward. We began a full renovation of his entire house. January was just a crazy, crazy month. I remember at various points being angry with God, being frustrated with God, being confused by what God was doing and not understanding the season that I was about ready to walk into. In many respects, as we're going to get into this morning, I realized how unprepared I was for the storm that was about to hit. And that was only the beginning. We were walking through that season. February comes around. Sierra and I are up, we're staying with my mom, taking care of my dad's house and cleaning and doing all that kind of stuff. Again, in February, we get a call in the middle of the night from my aunt trying to get a hold of us because my 18-year-old daughter, had been in some serious car accident. She was home taking care of the house, and she got into an accident at midnight, totaled her Leah's old car, the 84 Blazer, and has multiple injuries in the vehicle accident. So we drove home in the middle of the night with our daughter in the hospital, not knowing really what was going to happen in that particular situation. Because of the multiple injuries, it quickly came out that, hey, we may have to take care of these other families. Possible lawsuits were going to be in order, and we were in fear of all of that. I got back from my leave of absence. I preached 3 weeks, and then what? COVID, right? COVID hits. March comes around, COVID hits, shuts the world down, and we're all just scrambling. We're trying to figure out what this next storm was going to go for all of us. We immediately went to church online. There was so much uncertainty, not only in life, but in culture, in the world. And for us, in our context here, so much was on, was up in the air as far as what was going to happen with the church. And so from March through August, I was driving up to Northern California every other weekend. I would record the message on Thursday afternoon for us to go for church online. I would drive up to Northern California. I would spend Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, be at church online on my laptop at my mom's house with all of you, and I would drive back Sunday night to be here for staff meeting Monday morning, would work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, record Thursday, drive up. And that was like my life routine. It was crazy. I had 2 full-time jobs. And then April hits, and we get audited by the IRS, like the full 360-degree audit from the IRS, because we owned a business here in Santa Paula, and the IRS came and said, you're a new business. We want to audit you from 3 years prior, the year you started the business. It was like the random thing. Our CPA was like, I haven't seen one of those in over a decade. Your name literally got pulled out of a hat with the IRS, and they want to audit full everything. So my wife now had another part-time job. In May, while I was up at my mom's house taking care of stuff, we get a call at about 4:30 in the morning. I hear the phone ring in my mom's bedroom, and I hear my mom just kind of like gasp. And I get up out of the bed and I walk into the kitchen. She hangs up the phone and she just starts bawling. And she said, Holly just overdosed. This is my 18-year-old niece. She overdosed in her late at night. That previous night before is one of my daughter's closest family friends. They grew up together as childhood friends. She overdosed and died. My 18-year-old niece died. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is getting crazier and crazier. And then June comes. Murder of George Floyd happens and the world just goes unraveled. Remember those days? Totally unraveled. Riots, politics, racial division, and as my role as pastor, that was even a difficult time to be able to know how to speak into the situation. I've mentioned before that during that time of all the racial unrest, I did my best to try to talk about a biblical theology for racial relations and God's heart for justice. And so I'd preach the Bible, and then people would get emails from people saying that they're leaving because I was way too conservative on the issue. And then I'd get an email saying I was way too liberal, and it was the same sermon. You're like, what is happening right now? Like you're getting it from both. You couldn't open your mouth and say anything without people questioning you. And it was an enormously stressful time in the midst of all of this other stuff. In June as well, we had some staffing issues that some of you guys are aware of that really devastated us as a church during that season. My daughter graduated high school, had the cool drive-through graduation, didn't even get to, go through all of that. And then at the end of June, early July, my grandmother passes away. So she had lived with my mom during that season. She was 96. My mom was a World War II Polish POW survivor of World War II. Crazy story. And she wound up passing away. And God bless her. It was great in many respects. But it was also, heartache when your grandmother passes away. And in August of 2020, we helped move my mom into a community living situation. My dad's house finally gets taken care of. And I remember Sierra and I in mid to late August of 2020 driving out of my hometown. You guys live right down the street from my mom's house. We'll tell that story another time. But driving away from my parents' hometown in Livermore and going, we have no reason to ever come back here ever again. My mom doesn't live here anymore. My dad's passed away. And it was just a crazy season of transition for us. And I would say, without a shadow of a doubt, that season, next to my father's diagnosis of cancer when I was in college, was by far the roughest storm that I have ever faced. And my guess is that every single one of you in here can tell a similar story about a season of your life in which the storm seemed unbearable. Maybe for you it was death, divorce, poverty, abuse, heartache, sickness, abandonment, a failed business, failed marriage, hardships, persecutions, ongoing mental illness, relational conflict. Chances are every single one of us in here has faced a major, major life storm. We've all faced storms. In fact, The Apostle Peter, who's kind of one of the central people in the story that we're going to talk about this morning, said this in his letter to the churches later on in the New Testament. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, he says to the church, he says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange was happening to you." Peter's like, don't be surprised when the things in life don't go the way that you want them to, as if something weird was going on. So many of us, when storms hit us, we feel like it's a weird situation, that this shouldn't be happening to me, or this is the wrong time for it, or whatever that may be in the response. But Peter's like, guys, Christians, don't be surprised when things bad happen to you, as if something strange was happening to you, as if you were the outlier and that life was supposed to be perfectly good for you, and now it's not, and you're totally surprised by it. Peter's like, don't be surprised, because Peter walked through all of the things that we're going to be talking about this morning, but he also remembered the words of Jesus at the Last Supper. In John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus simply says this: in life, you will have what? Trouble. In life, you will have trouble. So I want to ask a question, is what did you do when the last storm hit you? What happened to your faith when the last storm hit you? More importantly, for the text that we're going to look in this morning, I want to ask you this question. Are you prepared for the next one? Are you prepared for the next storm that's going to hit your life? And how do you know if you're prepared? How do you know? In Mark chapter 4, there's a really familiar story for many of us who have been in church for a brief period of time, or any period of time. For those of you that haven't, maybe you're trying to kick in the tires of faith, or you're here, you're new. This may be a fairly new story to you, but for most of us, it's probably somewhat familiar. And the different Gospels kind of tell different facets of a similar story, and so this might be somewhat familiar to you. But really, when Jesus calms the storm in Mark chapter 4, we will learn something about the connection between faith and fear, and the role that Jesus' presence and his power plays in the midst of our storms. So in Mark chapter 4, we're going to kind of walk through this story and look at these different, what I call the calms throughout this story. In Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35, this is what it says. If you're there, say word. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. It says, that day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. So we're going to talk about the calm before the storm. So they're on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and if you don't know a whole lot about the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee is a very large body of water on the city of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, you might know it as. It's approximately 13 miles by 7 miles in its size. It's roughly shaped kind of like a harp, but the way the Sea of Galilee is situated is it's surrounded by hills and mountains. It's in a very, very deep valley. In fact, the Sea of Galilee is the lowest body of fresh water on earth. It's the lowest body of fresh water on earth. And it's still great to this day. Like, it's great for drinking water. There's still a large fishing industry that happens out of the Sea of Galilee in this day today. And there's very steep hills and cliffs that surround this, which makes it susceptible in that region for very sudden winds to be blown down the canyons and onto the Sea of Galilee. And storms and squalls often were known to come out of nowhere upon the fishermen and the people that were out on that sea. In fact, in 1992, it's documented that the winds of the Sea of Galilee created 10-foot waves that flooded the city of Tiberias on its shores. Just a lake. It's about roughly half the size of Lake Tahoe, but the waves got so big, they created 10-foot waves. And it says in here that there were also other boats that went here. So it wasn't just Jesus on his boat, which we're going to get into in a moment, but there were other boats that were following along suit. And if you know where this story is going, you know what's about to come next, don't you? But they didn't. They didn't know. They didn't know about the coming storm that was about to freak them all out. All the people in all the different fishing boats didn't know what was about to come. It was the calm before the storm. But who knew the storm was coming? Jesus knew the storm was coming. Why do you think Jesus would take all of these disciples and other people into the most dangerous possible place that they could be if he knew the storm was coming? Do you think about that? As parents, if you have children, and we have gone way to the extreme in our current culture that we've been in, this wave has been moving in this direction for the last 30, 40 years. As parents, we may not verbalize it, but our actions are proving it, that our children's safety is our number one priority. We don't want our children to be in unsafe situations, and we don't want our kids to bonk their heads, burn their hands, or poke their eyes out. And so we put cushions on every corner of every coffee table. We make sure that they don't get hurt in any way possible. I remember when I was a kid, I used to love jumping bikes. Anyone in here used to love jumping your bikes when you were a little kid, right? You ride your bike around the neighborhood, jumping your bikes, right? You build ramps. You build ramps out of like cardboard boxes and scrap wood that you can find in the garage. And how do you learn how to build a good ramp? By building cruddy ramps and eating crud with your face on the concrete, right? You're like, oh, I have to make this a little more stable. Like my dad was an engineer, and my dad would watch me build ramps, and he wouldn't say a thing. He would just be like, okay, this is gonna be fun to watch, right? My dad would watch me eat dirt and eat concrete and get scars and get beat up because he knew that the only way that I was going to learn how to build a proper ramp was not by him building it for me. It was by me with trial and error learning how to build a ramp and not get hurt. Because we realize as parents that if we do nothing to protect our kids from danger, they will never know the importance of the important balance of both fear and faith throughout their life. Now, safety for you as a parent, no judgment, but safety for you as a parent may be one of your highest priorities for your children, and that's okay. But it's not your Heavenly Father's for you. You ever think about that? Your safety is not God's highest priority for your life. This story illustrates it well. In fact, Jesus is the one that takes them onto that boat. It was Jesus' idea to go, hey guys, let's go for a boat ride. He knows what's coming. He is in control of the seas. He is in control of the weather patterns. He is God in the flesh. He is omnipresent. He's not omnipresent in human flesh, but he's omniscient. He knows everything that is going to happen in that moment. And Jesus is going to take them into the most dangerous place that they could possibly be on that evening. In fact, I wonder if Jesus got into the boat with certain disciples because he knew how they were going to respond to the storm. You ever wonder that? Like, as he's like kind of choosing which boat he's going to go on, he might be like, these guys need to be taught a lesson. I'm going to go with them. That might be you. Instead of taking them to the safest place, Jesus leads them to the most dangerous place that they could be on that evening. And Jesus is completely calm on that evening before the storm is ready to hit because he knows that he can handle it. The disciples are calm because they have no idea what's coming. The problem is that we're going to see here is that the disciples that are on the boat with Jesus were unprepared to handle the storm that was coming. They were unprepared for the storm that was coming. If you'd be willing, just by raise of hands, how many of you feel like you're in a little bit of a storm of life right now? Yeah, I know. Your mom just passed away last week. Like, it's one of the most brutal things you can walk through. So raise of hands. How many of you are going through it right now? Okay. Thank you for being. By raise of hands, how many of you are not? Let's just raise, like, you're like, okay, things are pretty good. It's okay. Don't be ashamed of good times, right? Raise your hand, right? Raise your hand. Okay, like things are okay right now, right? You should be freaked out right now because you know the storm is coming. Honestly, right? Because we know life doesn't stay awesome. The question I have for the second group that raised your hand this morning is, are you prepared? Are you prepared for the next storm that's going to come? Because these guys, as we're going to see in the boat with Jesus, were completely unprepared for the storm that was coming their way. And the question I think we have to wrestle with is, if we're in a good place and we know the storm is coming, is, are we prepared for it? In that, and I'm going to unpack that right now, is when the storm of life comes, what will that do to your trust in God? What will the storm do to your trust in God? Will you, when the storm hits, will you lean into your faith and trust in God? Or will your response be similar to the disciples of the boat? Watch what happens next. Verse 37. It says, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up. They all came running to the front of the boat, and they woke him up. And they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Let's talk about the calm in the storm here. So the storm hits the boat, and there's a couple of different responses to the storm. Let's look at the disciples' response to the storm first. Did they have a good response or a bad response? They had a very human response, didn't they? Good or bad? Like, that's, I think if we were all in that situation, we would probably have a very similar response. But they were freaking out. Okay? Can we all agree that they were freaking out? Good or bad, human, whatever. Like, they were freaking out. Why? Number one is that they were physically unprepared for the storm. Now, this is an interesting thing to note. What is the occupation of most of the guys on that boat? They were freaking out. They had never seen a storm that large before. These were experienced fishermen and sailors. And the storm was too big for them. And they freaked out. They were surprised by it. And they were physically unprepared to handle that. Their physical unpreparedness, in many respects, led them to be afraid. But what were they afraid of? What were they afraid of? They were afraid of the storm. It's a natural response, is to be afraid of the storm. They probably felt like that their lives were in danger. In fact, you see that in the way that they come before Jesus, right? That, don't you care if we drown? Like, don't you care if we die on this lake? They were fearful of the storm. Fear is a good thing. Fear can do a lot of good things for us. It keeps us out of trouble. Andy Stanley, if you guys know who Andy Stanley is, famous American preacher, he says this about fear. I found this quote. He says, "Fear is the byproduct of our ability to project into the future and remember the past." Like, we're the only ones that experience fear in this way. Like, other animals don't experience fear the same way that we do, because as human beings, we're the only ones really that have the ability to project into the future and remember the past at the same time, and that's what creates this level of fear. But they, keep note of that, they feared the storm, okay? Thirdly, is that they were also spiritually unprepared for this storm. Because one, they feared the storm, and their faith was in the storm. They believed that their fate was in the hands of the storm. Think about that. They thought that the fate of their lives was in the hands of the storm. How many of us, when circumstances of our lives turn south, do we automatically actually put our faith in the circumstances? Because we believe that our destiny is going to be determined by the storm. So they have misplaced fear and they have misplaced faith. What do you do when storms hit you? It's an important question to ask ourselves. If we are anything like the disciples, some of us will admit that we fear the wrong thing. We fear the wrong thing. Like, we legitimately fear that circumstances of our lives are in control of our lives. I mean, I'm not making any sort of a broader statement here, but how many of us in the church over the last 2 years have lived in fear of circumstances? I mean, it's legitimate, but do we really believe that the world we live in controls our destiny? Or is it God? Where is our faith? And where is our fear? The disciples, they feared the wrong thing because they were afraid of the storm. The disciples also, in their mistake, instead of first going to Jesus, where did they go? They went to one another. Right? It says collectively they went to Jesus and woke him up. It was like the mob going before him and shaking him, and like, you can imagine Jesus wakes up and he's like, what the heck? Like, all you guys, you should be like bailing out the boat. Right? What are you doing up here? Right? Because they all went to each other. You can imagine as they're fighting the storm, their first response was not to go to the one that they already knew controlled nature. They already knew that he controlled nature. He has performed miracles and cast out demons. They knew the power of Jesus, and where was the first place that they went? To other people. How many of us in the storms of our lives, the first people we go to are those that we're closest to? Not that that's wrong, but I think for the believer, we have to examine ourselves and say, is that the best place to go first? Is the best place to go to your family, to your mom, to your dad, to your best friends, and process through the storms that are going through with you. It says a lot about how we handle the storms by who we go to first when the storm hits us. Because these guys didn't go to Jesus, they went to one another. And I wonder, like, in that collective group, who was the first one to be like, hey, we should probably wake them up? I think Jesus might be able to solve this problem. Or they don't even know he's going to solve the problem. They're going to go and complain because Jesus is asleep. And so what do they do when they wake up Jesus? What is the first thing that they do? They blame him for not caring. Don't you care about us? You're sleeping. Don't you care about the storm on the outside? Don't you care about what that's doing to us right now? Don't you care that if this thing doesn't get handled on our boat, we're all gonna drown? God, don't you care that I can't pay my bills? God, don't you care that my marriage is falling apart? God, don't you care that my kid's going through that chronic illness? God, don't you care about my healing? God, don't you care that I can't feed my family right now? Don't you care that my retirement is going to be delayed? God, don't you care that my marriage is struggling right now? God, don't you care that my child is the prodigal that has run away from faith and family, wants nothing to do with this? God, don't you care that I have all this relational conflict in my life? God, don't you care? In all transparency, I said that to God at least 24 times in the first 6 months of 2020. Even pastors, my job is to try to be like Jesus, right? Like, that's my job. I'm just like you. How many times in my storm I'm like, God, don't you care? God, we had plans for Catalyst Church in January of 2020. We had plans. We had a vision. We had a plan. We were getting ready to execute it. God, this is the worst possible time for my dad to get sick and die. Don't you care? I got other things going on right now. Don't you and it was a wrestling for me. Through tears, prayer, great conversation with friends helped me work this stuff out. There were many times in which I cried out and blamed God. There were many times in which I went to other people before I went to God with my problems in the storm. That's what we do when we're human. And I realized that there were moments in my greatest storm of my life that I was unprepared. I was just flat out unprepared. But the one thing that I did have, that I know many, or if not most of you have, that I had in the storm, is that I had Jesus in my boat. Can you imagine what it must have been like for the other boats in the story? They didn't have anywhere to go. There may be some of you in here, you're going through it, or you're going to go through it soon, and you're not following Jesus. And the storm's going to hit, and you're going to run around your boat, and he's not there because you chose to get on a different boat. See, when you're following Jesus, he is always in your boat. You're in his boat. Let's make it that way. You're in his boat. It's his boat. But Jesus has a very different response from the rest of the disciples, doesn't he? He's asleep. It's pretty clear that Jesus was a heavy sleeper. How many of you are heavy sleepers in here? Heavy sleepers, right? I had a roommate in college, heaviest sleeper I have ever known in my entire life. I'm a fairly heavy sleeper. This dude was a heavy sleeper. So much so that we loved writing on his face while he was taking. So we were terrible friends and roommates, but we would have plans. We'd have plans. Like, we're going downtown Santa Barbara. We're going downtown, in the afternoon. We're leaving at 2:00. We have plans. So we're all ready to go, and we walk in, and there's Jason, not Pastor Jason, same name, different dude. Jason is fast asleep on the bed, and you cannot wake that dude up. And so we would just start writing on his face. We're like, we're going to teach you a lesson right now. You knew that we were going to leave at 2:00, and so we're going to draw things on your face. And he wouldn't wake up. And then there were a couple times when we get downtown, he would go to the bathroom, and he would look in the bathroom, and there would be writing on his face. He'd been out for like an hour before he knew that there was actually, it was fun. It was college. You do that kind of stuff. Heavy sleepers. So there's light sleepers, there's heavy sleepers, and then there's Jesus heavy sleepers, right? Jesus is asleep on that boat. But you see it in the story, man. Jesus is not surprised, and he's not worried about the storm at all, is he? Why? Because storms don't ever surprise God the way they surprise us. They don't ever surprise God. I'll say this too. This is a free one. The rest is going to cost you. No. Also, Jesus is not surprised by your sin. You don't do that, and then he's like, oh, didn't see that coming. He's like, yeah, I know. You're an idiot. I know. But I love you so much, I'm still going to send my son to die on the cross and forgive it. I know, you're an idiot. I know you did it. I know you're going to do it again. Not that it excuses our sin, but nothing surprises God at all. He sees everything. Now, for some of you, that's really a scary thought, that Jesus sees everything, right? Like, that's a very scary thought. But that's why Jesus is so calm in the storm. It's like, this is nothing for him. This is nothing for him. This is nothing for him. He's sovereign, he's powerful, he's omniscient. God is omnipresent. He's everywhere with us in the midst of our storm. And what we perceive as Jesus sleeping, I think, is Jesus just having the proper perspective on storms. He's like, yeah, I got this. I got it. Come on. And he also knows why the storm is there. The questions that we ask in storms should not be, God, why is this happening to me? Or why now? Or why me? It's, Jesus, what are you trying to teach me right now? This doesn't surprise you. And in fact, you might have even asked me to walk on this boat with you in this storm. You may have brought me into this storm for a bigger purpose. So it's not why me, God? It's, God, what are you trying to teach me on here? Because clearly, God is trying to teach the disciples a lesson about who he is and their trust or their faith in him in the midst of that storm. And so Jesus gets up, he shows off, he calms the storm. And he didn't calm the storm to save their life. He calmed their storm to show them how misplaced their fear and faith was. To show them that he is really, truly in control of everything. It's not the storm that they need to be afraid of. It's Jesus. It's not the storm that they should put their faith in. It's Jesus. And so then he stands up, he wakes up, throws some water on his face, right? And what does he say? He says, quiet, quiet, be still. Now, Mark chooses to tell those specific words of Jesus and how he calms the storm for a very intentional reasons. If you look back in Mark chapter 1, when Jesus casts out the first demon, it's just about the same phrase that he says to the demon when he casts it out that he does to the storm. And the reason why is that in the Jewish tradition, we talked about this a few weeks ago, we talked about demons, is that Jews, most of them had a mythology in which the demons lived under the water. Most Jews were very, very fearful of going onto the lake. Fishermen was a risky occupation because most people didn't want to go in the water or near the water because they believed that demons lived in the water. And so when Mark tells the story and Jesus stands up and says, be still and be quiet, in the same way that he did to the man who was possessed by a demon, he's again showing that Jesus not only has the authority over nature by calming the storm, but he also has authority over the supernatural. It's one of Mark's themes throughout all of the gospel, is that Jesus not only has the authority over the natural, but he also has authority over the supernatural. And so Mark wants you and I to know, in his gospel that there is nothing Jesus can't do. There is nothing he cannot do in your life, and there is nothing he will not do for you. He is both able and he's willing. And so we move into the calm after the storm. Look what happens next. Verse 40. He said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? See the connection between fear and faith that Jesus is making here? Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Verse 41. They were what? And they asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. The translation of their statement, I'm going to walk back a little bit. Jesus asked this question because the disciples knew that Jesus had done all these other similar things. Jesus knew that they had borne witness to casting out demons and healing, and somehow they thought that this was too big for him. And these are important questions. God's going to ask you this. Why are you so afraid? And do you still have no faith? These are very important questions for us to ask ourselves before the storm hits. These aren't the best questions in the midst of the storm. These are the best questions to ask ourselves before the storm hits. What are you really afraid of? And do you have the faith to get through the storm? And it's interesting here because their fear shifted. In verse 41, it says they were terrified. Just a couple minutes ago, what were they afraid of? The storm. And after Jesus calms the storm, now what are they afraid of? Oh, dang. They were freaked out. They were afraid of him. So their fear shifted from the circumstances to Jesus because they knew that Jesus holds their destiny, not the storm. And their faith also changed as well, didn't it? And then they ask themselves this rhetorical question. They're like, who is this guy? Here's the translation of that statement for you and I. I didn't think Jesus could do that. I didn't think Jesus could do that. Like when he walks you through something, I mean, how often do we like, I didn't think Jesus could do that? They were just like, they were freaked out and they're like, wow, Jesus really is who he says he is. He really is in control of everything. He really does have authority over the natural and the supernatural. Jesus actually does have control over our eternal destiny and the forgiveness of our sins, just as he had illustrated a couple stories before that. I didn't know Jesus could do that. And all of a sudden, this like awakening for them. They were like, whoa, some of you need that awakening. Yeah, Jesus can do that. And you've had misplaced fear and misplaced faith your entire life. And Mark wants you to know this morning that he can be trusted. That these disciples, and if you're following Jesus, this is true for you as well, that these guys were following the one who commands both the winds and the waves. And so are you. They were following the one who actually does care about their livelihood. He does that for you too. They were following the one who had the power over the natural and the supernatural, and so do you. See, Jesus can be trusted even in the midst of life's most chaotic and fearful circumstances. Here's the crazy thing about the disciples' story, and the reason why I love the honesty of the Gospels is because this is who all of us are. All of us are just like this. Can you imagine you're on that boat and you're like, oh man, that was nuts, right? Oh man, like that was crazy. Jesus did something we didn't think he was capable of doing. And then he goes to the cross and he is crucified for blasphemy, claiming that he was God, and he was crucified. And what did all the disciples do next? They ran in fear. You think, you're like, what a bunch of morons, right? Like, didn't they see what he did on the lake? Didn't they see what he did to the demon-possessed men and women and the healings that he did and the things that he did throughout his 3.5 years of ministry? And even after all of that, they feared for their lives after the crucifixion. Man, these guys are just like you and me, right? We've seen Jesus do the most amazing things in our lives, yes or no? Yes, yet we still act like these guys in the storms, yes or no? Yes, but that's not the way God wants us to walk in faith with him, because he can be trusted. This is why Jesus said in John chapter 16, verse 33, this is how that verse ends. Jesus says, in this life you will have what? Trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Oh, The storm, the story of Jesus calming the storm is just a micro story about who this guy really is and what he does for our lives. And so how prepared are you for the coming storm? Will you be prepared or unprepared? I'm going to give you, for those of you who feel it maybe a little bit unprepared, I'm just going to give you 4 quick things. I know I'm over time, but 4 little things that you can do to prepare yourself for the next storm. This is probably where the notes might want to be taken here. Is I would encourage you, if you're feeling unprepared for the next storm or you're nervous about what the next storm might do for you and your faith, I would encourage you, number 1, is to practice gratitude every single day. Practice gratitude every single day in the little things. Give God credit and be grateful for everything that you have. The paycheck, the food, the roof, the warm bed, the people that you love in your life as gifts from God. And practice gratitude in the little things. You will start to see your life's blessings as gifts from God. Second thing is to practice praising him regularly. And what I mean by that is to practice seeing life through his eyes. When we do that, we will be less inclined to blame him for the circumstances later on. Gratitude and praise, in many cases, is the antidote to blame. Third is to practice praying first. Practice praying first. When something doesn't go right, you get an argument with the boss, job's in danger, you have whatever. Go to God first. Go to God first. If your first inclination is to call or text, your significant other, just go, okay, nope, don't do that. Pray first. And pray and practice going to Jesus first in the small things. And then lastly, I would encourage you guys to also practice faith. Trust Jesus with the right decisions now. Practice your best to pursue holiness, to practice Christ-likeness, generosity, love, grace. Trust Jesus that by obeying him is going to lead you in the right path instead of trusting in your own understanding. See, faith grows, doesn't it? The more we trust God in the little things, the easier it is to trust him in the big things. And so you can begin to build your faith muscles in the little things by just saying, God, I don't know why you're asking me to do this, but I'm just going to do it and I'm going to trust you in it. If you begin to trust God in the little things, when the storm comes, you're going to learn how to trust him with the big. So prepare yourself for the coming storm, guys. Prepare yourself.